It's time for Coach Johnston's NFL draft. We received over 20 responses, which helped grade Coach as a prospect. After an early commit last year, former friend and current rival DeBradford Walls was drafted in the second round to the Minnesota Vikings, and this is what scouts had to say about the 6'3 wide receiver out of Michigan. Not the fastest kid, but a great deep route runner as well as decent hands, kind of overrated in my opinion, late second to mid third round prospect, made no progress in his college career. While another scout gushed over Johnston, saying he's an amazing player, he has the release of a god, he was a team player and a wasted talent. And other scouts were more critical. Coach's college stats are amazing, but I see a lot of Corey Davis in him. He doesn't have high-end speed, and he can run the route tree, but not to an elite level. He could get picked up in the mid to late second, but there's no trait that really has him standing out from the crowd. Additional comments came in from other scouts across the nation. Coach is a great wideout, but lacks route discipline. He's a big physical receiver with good speed and great hands and great route running. Although Coach struggled to get open against most top opponents, he has elite top end speed and great route running, and his pro comparison is Julio Jones. And finally, Coach has great catching with average to below average route running, comparing him to a mix of Deebo Samuel and Randy Moss. And finally, in the mid-second round, pick number 13, the Tennessee Titans selected Coach Johnston out of Michigan. Colton started his NFL career with a normal development trajectory based on his lack of growth from his college career. And one thing that shocked everyone was how muscular Coach had gotten. He had put on over 15 pounds of muscle between the end of the college season and the draft. There were rumors that he slid in the draft for some teams because of the fear that he may be taking PEDs. Johnston struggled with injuries during his rookie season, which kept him moving in and out of the lineup, preventing him from developing a real consistent chemistry with his quarterback Baker Mayfield. While back in Minnesota, Walls was enjoying a successful second season in the league. The Vikings had a major turnaround after drafting both Walls and their quarterback of the future, Spencer Rudolph. Against Washington, DB was disruptive in both man and zone assignments. Both the Vikings and the Titans ended up making the playoffs, and Coach finished his first season with almost breaking 1,000 yards and racking up 4 touchdowns despite all of his injuries. Walls finished his second year tied for the most picks on the team at 3. Coach and the Titans were fighting an uphill battle playing against Joe Burrow and the Bengals in Cincinnati in the middle of a snowstorm, and the Titans were down early, and the pressure of the moment got to this young team, and the whole offense just looked disjointed and confused. It only got worse in the second when Baker forced a ball to Coach near the end zone that got picked off, and the Titans looked sluggish and lifeless on the field. Coach tried his best to rally the team behind a solid performance from the rookie, but Baker ended up throwing 4 interceptions in the game, and the Bengals knocked the Titans out of the playoffs without much of a problem, 38-17. Coach finished with 5 catches for 78 yards, and meanwhile the Vikings were matched up with the Eagles in the wild card. DB had a similar downfall at the end of the year that was similar to his rookie season. He was getting fried by Devonta Smith, and once again his performance left a bad taste in Vikings fans' mouths. Luckily for him though, Byron Murphy and Karen Bynum picked up the slack. Murphy got a crucial interception before the half, and in the second half, the Vikings D held up and forced a 3-and-out on a key drive in the fourth quarter, and the Vikings went on to win 34-26. The following week, DB would have to shake off that self-doubt and suit up against the Niners in Santa Clara for the divisional. For whatever reason, the Vikings had already shown in the past that they had the Niners number, and even though the Niners hosted, the Vikings played very comfortably behind the calm presence of their second-year quarterback Spencer Rudolph. DB was making rookie mistakes, and the Niners receivers were taking advantage. DeBradford resolved to play a more conservative style against the Niners because of this, and because the dump-off passes to McCaffrey were killing them. Walls single-handedly shut down the underneath passes to CMC, and Murphy got another game-clinching pick, which would mean an NFC Championship game versus the Cowboys. DeBradford received a call before the game from Coach, and Coach said that even though they weren't actively talking to each other, he knew DB was going to have a big game. And Walls did. He recovered a crucial fumble on the Cowboys' first drive, and DB knew that he could play some mind games against Dak. He was playing very conservatively, getting secure tackles, but also not getting big stops in the passing game. Walls should have given up a TD on the second Cowboys drive, but he hustled to make a tackle at the 1, and what are you supposed to do on the 1? Run the football. Walls jumped the slant route and outran the entire Cowboys team down the sideline to give his team a 14-point lead behind his fumble recovery and pick 6. Maybe the words of encouragement from Coach were exactly what he needed. DB didn't really have anyone in his personal corner after cutting off his parents because of their toxicity, and when times got tough and he'd make mistakes, he didn't really have anyone to lean on. Despite a great performance and a big first quarter lead, the Cowboys would come back and steal the game and the Super Bowl berth. The Vikings fell just 8 points short. After accusations of steroid abuse were reported, Koch was admitted to a drug test before his rookie season began, but later on, the league put Koch through a more comprehensive test which found trace amounts of performance-enhancing drugs in his system, and Koch was suspended for the first 4 games of the season, which made his relationship with the Titans front office even more strained. Walls began to progress even more quickly after a standout performance in the NFC Championship game, and in his 3rd year, he became better at identifying routes pre-snap to help cut off drags and slants. He was even better at identifying wide receiver runoffs, and he would more quickly dive on the running back, but it wasn't always a success, like when he played against the Dolphins and Achane made him look foolish. At the end of the season, the Vikings made the playoffs again, while the Titans missed it. Koch had a similar season to that of his rookie year, despite fewer games played, although it might have evened out after injuries in his rookie season. In the playoffs, the Vikings hosted the Seahawks, and Walls and Koch hadn't spoken since the last time Koch had called before the NFC Championship game, and Walls was actually hoping that Koch would call him again to pump him up, but make no mistake, he didn't want to call first. And both teams were throwing haymakers, and the Vikings escaped with the win to move on to the divisional, and again, the Vikings were playing in Santa Clara, and they had supreme confidence going into the game. They felt like playing in Santa Clara was a second home field, and after winning the divisional just last year in Cali, the Vikings were excited to play against the Niners. The Niners had already made 3 field goals when Ayuk broke a slant for a 60-yard touchdown, and the Vikings ended up fighting back to tie the game at 24 and put the ball in the hands of the Niners offense with under a minute remaining. And Walls made the biggest play of the game, solo tackling McCaffrey for a loss near the 50-yard line and putting San Fran out of field goal range for the buzzer beater. The teams went to overtime. In OT, DB continued to step up, clamping Debo on first down to force the drop, and when DB played with confidence, he played so much more freely. Unfortunately, a Vikings DB got burnt on a go route for another big touchdown from Ayuk, which tied the game and gave the Vikings a chance for a walk-off field goal. Spencer Rudolph in the offense got the field goal, and the Vikings proved again they had a mental advantage over this Niners squad. It also meant that the Vikings were headed back to the NFC Championship game for another chance at going to the Super Bowl. Walls had been a part of a lot of team success for a 3rd-year player already, while Koch had only grown when thinking about how his Titans got blown out in a wild card snow game against the Bengals one time. The Vikings also felt pretty comfortable playing against the Eagles, another team they had eliminated in the playoffs just the previous season. It almost seemed like fate or destiny that the Vikings were going to go to the Super Bowl as they were playing the best of any team in the league. But the game came down to the last play, and Steffens made the game-clinching pick with 2 seconds remaining to send the Vikings to the Super Bowl. After the game, Koch called DB once again and congratulated him on making it to the bowl, and he said that one day he hoped that both the Vikings and his Titans squad would be playing against each other in the big game. The Vikings couldn't have started the game any better against the Raiders with a touchdown on the board and DeBradford pulling in a huge interception, but the Raiders were far from giving up. Despite the pick, Rudolph and the offense were unable to materialize points, while the combination of Devontae Adams, DeAndre Hopkins, and Josh Jacobs was incredibly challenging to deal with. Walls got caught playing too far inside on the run, and Jacobs took it all the way for a game-sealing touchdown, while the Vikings were set up better and playing better than every other team in the league. To blow it on the biggest stage was demoralizing. After giving DB that talk about the Titans and Vikings playing each other in the Super Bowl, Koch was traded to the Lions just a month later. So Koch would be in the same division as DB, playing him twice a year and playing in the same state he played college ball out. Koch's career hadn't panned out how he had thought up to this point. Koch had fired and sued his agent after slipping him performance-enhancing drugs before the draft, and Koch's tenure with the Titans was disappointing to say the least, and he was less than thrilled while playing with Baker as his quarterback. Goff wasn't leaps and bounds better, but Koch was surrounded by much more talent on this team, and Johnston felt at home in Michigan. Midway through the season, the Lions and Vikings got their first chance to play against each other, and diehard Ohio State and Michigan fans were extremely excited to see them play against each other once again. In moments like these, when everything felt surreal, Koch would ground himself by remembering how DeBradford and him were just 2 kids who came from Paris and London, Kentucky, playing a kids game they loved all their lives. Koch might have had the best first 3 quarters of his NFL career, but DB started lining up more and more against him and less against St. Brown starting in the 4th quarter. The Vikings scored a touchdown to take the lead, and DeBradford was in coverage on Koch on 2nd down. Koch used to be able to bully Walls on go routes because of his height advantage, but growing an inch since joining the NFL must have helped Walls as he picked off the pass and turned the momentum completely in the Vikings' favor. The Vikings would continue their playoff streak, looking to make up for the Super Bowl loss, but they would end up losing in the first round to the Panthers, while Koch's Lions missed the playoffs entirely. DeBradford had grown tremendously as a corner, becoming one of the top 10 corners in the league. Koch and DB would match up again in the regular season, and Johnston became frustrated with his lack of production. Walls covered him for most of the game this matchup, and Koch delivered a little forearm block to knock Walls on his butt, but the Vikings still blew the Lions out. The Vikings playoff streak ended, and the Lions missed the playoffs again. The Lions let Koch go on to free agency, where Koch's value had clearly diminished. His best offer was to make $10 million per year over 2 years, and while Koch was thinking about joining the Vikings, he decided to go to Tampa instead, where his favorite receiver, Mike Evans, built his Hall of Fame career. Koch asked for Mike's permission to wear his high school number 13, and Mike was cool with it. Without a quarterback, the Bucs drafted Noah Fredrickson with a 14th overall pick. Behind the future of the franchise, Koch was happy to build something from the ground up right when he was entering his prime. He generally excelled in the Bucs practices, but the Bucs wanted a running back, and they shipped Koch off to Miami to play for the Dolphins before the season even began. The Dolphins had ridiculous depth. They lost Tua and Tyreek, but they had Waddle, a 6'9" receiver, and Jaden Reed, and Koch was worried that he was going to lose his playing time, so he did the only logical thing he could think of. He moved to tight end. This is not how the star receiver from Michigan thought his career would play out, but as scouts noted in the draft, the dude was a team player, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make a positive impact for his team, despite the anger he had over being traded immediately after signing with the Buccaneers. Koch showed out in his game versus the Raiders, proving to everyone that not only could he be a receiving threat, but he was a pretty damn good blocker too. Despite a great performance from Johnston, the Raiders won on a walk-off field goal. The Dolphins still managed to make the playoffs, and Koch finally re-emerged in the wild card for the first time since his rookie season. Koch had a career-low receiving yards and catches, but still put up 6 touchdowns in a pass-heavy offense. Koch desperately wanted revenge against the Bucs in the first round, but he experienced heartbreak yet again when the Bucs walked off with another last-second field goal to knock the Dolphins out. Meanwhile, the Vikings were back in the playoffs, and their first-round matchup was against the Lions, who won the NFC North. After dropping Koch, the Lions had picked up Nico Collins. Collins legitimately destroyed DB in their matchup and was a huge reason why the Lions won the game and then won the Super Bowl. And Koch was disgusted with his loss to the Bucs, and with the Lions dropping and replacing him and then winning it all 1 year after not even sniffing the playoffs. In his 6th season, Koch got to play against DB and the Vikings again. It was a different matchup for Koch, who was blanketed by Walls in their last game. This time, playing from the tight end position, Koch was able to feast on interior linebackers and safeties, although the Vikings did have some of the best middle linebackers in the league. Koch wanted some sweet revenge, but he was humbled yet again with a 16-13 loss. Neither team made the playoffs, and Koch had a marginally more impactful season with the Dolphins. In year 7, the Dolphins drafted rookie quarterback DJ Fowler, who had a relatively unproductive season with just 19 touchdowns and 13 picks. Koch's production suffered because of this, and the Dolphins had the worst record in the league, wasting one of Koch's prime years. Koch was focusing on his individual development during the 4-13 season, and he made sure his parents moved to Florida with him after his first year with the Dolphins a few years ago. By his 8th season, the Dolphins roster was decimated. He was the best player on the team, and he was really happy about the draft pick Smallwood, but he knew he didn't fit the Dolphins' rebuilding timeline. Back to Koch's parents. He was nervous about moving them out of Kentucky after his immediate trade from Tampa, but he rented a place for them in Florida so that they could move with him to wherever his next destination would be, because he didn't like what was going on with the Miami franchise. He saw that Walls quarterback Rudolph had just won MVP and was strongly considering asking for a trade to Minnesota, but he refused to do it unless DB reached out to him first about it. The Dolphins missed the playoffs, of course, while the Vikings were the perennial favorites to win the Super Bowl, and DB started with a huge punch out of the ball against Bijan, and then in the third quarter, he baited the Falcons into a pick in the back of the end zone. DB showed up when the lights were their brightest. He wasn't nervous about his playoff performances anymore. He didn't have the option of failure. He didn't allow himself to have any outside distractions, and that, combined with his extensive amount of experience in the playoffs already, made him one of the best 3 corners in the league at this point. Against Bryce Young and the Panthers, Walls put on a masterclass of baiting the quarterback. His teammates were no slouches either, but Walls started the game with a pick and then effectively ended the game with a pick. The Vikings were up 3 near the end of the 4th, and DB picked off a pass intended for Bryce's tight end near the end zone, and the Vikings were headed back to the NFC Championship game again after they won 13-10. The Vikings took care of business in the NFC Championship, and then to start the Super Bowl, Walls jumped a zig route for a pick 6. It seemed like a storybook Super Bowl win after battling for years in the playoffs and facing so many unexpected defeats. Walls had one of the best defensive units on his side and the best quarterback in the league in Rudolph. Walls was feeling very confident, but that confidence was erased by a last-second laser beam throw over Walls' head in OT after the Jets clawed their way back into the game. After both teams had already scored, the Jets would win with a touchdown, and Walls couldn't believe he got beat one-on-one to lose the Super Bowl. After the game, he completely blamed himself for the loss. Walls was in the locker room crying before the clock even expired. He blamed himself for his team losing the game, and he thought that they would never have a chance to win it again. He looked down at his phone and saw a text from Koch. Coke said to him, "You were not the reason your team didn't win." DB called Coke and the two talked on the phone for days, and Walls finally apologized for ghosting him and recognized it was a crappy thing to do. Coke understood what DB's parents were like, and Coke said he wanted DB to convince his GM to come get him. So the Dolphins, already in rebuild mode, traded Coke to the Vikings. The Vikings were the favorites to win the Super Bowl with their acquisition of Coke, who had become the best tight end in the league. And maybe he wasn't the best blocker, but he was definitely the best receiving tight end by far. In the wild card, Coke and DB got the chance to get some revenge against the Bucs, who had tormented Coke for years after trading him. Coke put on some weight to play tight end back with the Dolphins, and I guess not many league officials were paying attention at the time because the Fins were so bad, but once the Vikings made the playoffs, they immediately were sending out a request for PED checks on Coke. And Coke never told the league what had happened with his agent, but he wasn't on anything now. He had the opportunity to put on muscle mass because of how bad his team was. He got to focus a lot more on his skill set and longevity in the league while dealing with the day-to-day grind of being on the worst record team in the NFL. Coke partially blamed the situation on the Bucs, who he felt he could have been a major asset for at wide receiver, so he was thrilled to send them home and eventually make it to his first Super Bowl and DB's third. The only reason his career trajectory had changed in a positive way, though, is because of his move to tight end. Coke didn't want to make that switch, but it just stuck, and there was no need for him to play receiver with the Vikings, who already had Jordan Addison. Casey Archer was the man DB and the defense needed to slow down, and the guy that had a similar build to Coke. Despite great coverage, Archer just jumped over DB for the catch and score, and the Texans were up 3 before half, and the Vikings had one shot to score a touchdown from the 36. Coke ran a go, and Rudolph tried to fit the ball into the window, and the DB got his hands on it and knocked it away, but Coke grabbed it and scored the touchdown with 5 seconds remaining. If the Vikings won, Coke was an early favorite for Super Bowl MVP, and in the second half, the Texans had scored and gotten the ball back, but this time Archer wasn't going to catch one over to Bradford, who pulled in the interception, and they kept targeting Archer, and DB made him pay again with another pick in the same area of the field, and DB returned the pick, leaped over a lineman, and almost got the pick 6. DB took that first touchdown personally, and with the game on the line, got his third interception when the Texans targeted Archer. Finally, the Vikings got the monkey off their back and won a Super Bowl. DB and Coke gave each other a hug, and DB told Coke he couldn't have done it without his brother. Coke's parents, wife, and kids celebrated with them, and they enjoyed the Super Bowl after party, which was in Tampa Bay, where the Super Bowl was hosted, which was the little cherry on top for Coke. Coke had 120 yards and a touchdown, while DB had the 3 interceptions. The Vikings were back in year 10 for Coke and 11 for DB, and the team absolutely had a Super Bowl hangover, playing very sloppy football on offense and defense, and it resulted in a 7-10 record that kept them out of the playoffs. Time was flying by for the two childhood best friends, and in their third season together, they were blown out in the divisional against the Seahawks, and while Coke got a 5-year extension, DB had already begun to regress, and so DB had slowed down significantly and ended up being signed in free agency by the Jets in year 12 for him. And after losing the heart of their defense, the Vikings missed the playoffs and the Jets made the playoffs. It was kind of funny that the team that broke DB, the team that scored a double overtime walk-off touchdown in the Super Bowl onto Bradford, signed him to be their number 1 corner. Age became a factor in the playoffs though, and DB was so slow that he could only play zone coverage for the most part. He was the slowest player on the field aside from defensive tackles, and he was benched in their wildcard game against the Ravens, but re-emerged as the CB1 against the Cardinals when the Jets somehow ended up making the Super Bowl. In his 4th Super Bowl, the Jets were never really in the game, and DB simply couldn't perform at an elite level enough to make the same game-altering plays in his last Super Bowl with the Vikings. After the Super Bowl loss, DB called up Coke and told him that he was hanging up his cleats after 12 seasons in the league. Coke and DB spent all summer together back in their home state of Kentucky, and the two always thought that they were on to bigger and better things and that they'd outgrow Paris and London, but after chaotic NFL careers with so many ups and downs, some quiet and simplicity was exactly what the two wanted. And Coke decided to stay on the Vikings despite the team missing the playoffs the previous season. Coke had one more productive season before the writing was on the walls, no pun intended, as the Vikings signed a younger and better tight end at the offseason, which would relegate him to the bench. Coke was ready for retirement, and he was ready to spend time with his best friend, probably doing something else competitive, and his son, Junior, was excited to see his uncle DB again. Coke retired, and the two local boys accomplished their dreams.